listening to an MRCT Center podcast. We are the multi-regional clinical trial center of Brigham and Women's Hospital and Harvard. Our mission is to engage diverse stakeholders to define emerging issues across all stages of global clinical trials and to create and implement ethical, actionable, and practical solutions. Welcome. I am Barbara Bierer, Faculty Director of the MRCT Center and Professor of Medicine and Pediatrics at the Brigham and Women's Hospital and Harvard Medical School. I will be the moderator today for our conversation on navigating the MRCT Center's long-term follow-up toolkit for gene therapies. I'm joined today by Carolyn Chapman, leader of the Cell and Gene Therapies project at the MRCT Center and lead investigator, Brigham and Women's Hospital, and member of the faculty of Harvard. We're here today to talk about the toolkit for supporting the design, conduct, and reporting of long-term follow-up, or LTFU, studies for gene therapies. Carolyn, welcome. To set the stage for our listeners, what are long-term follow-up studies for gene therapies and why are they needed?
Thanks so much for having me, Barbara. So, some context. Gene therapies are a complex class of therapeutics, and in simple terms, they modify our DNA. So for that reason, many gene therapies have the potential for long-lasting and transformative health benefits, but they also come with the potential for long-term health risks. And so for that reason, the FDA and other regulatory authorities around the world recommend long-term follow-up studies of recipients of certain types of gene therapies. And the results of those long-term follow-up studies provide valuable information for many different stakeholders, not just regulators. That includes patients, pharmaceutical and health insurance companies, and the medical community and society at large. And that's because understanding the long-term safety and efficacy of gene therapies is important for decision-making in both research and clinical care. And long-term follow-up results also have implications for regulatory evaluation, investment into these gene therapies, and as well as reimbursement policies for them. And while this long-term follow-up information is important, the studies can last years, perhaps even decades. So there are significant scientific, operational, logistical, and ethical challenges associated with them. And they're burdensome for both the companies, academic investigators, and the patients. And so that's why we took this up as one of the projects at the MRCT Center.
So that's very, very helpful. And you describe a number of representatives who could use this, but who's the toolkit designed for? And why did the MRCT Center identify them as the primary users?
So really the toolkit is designed or made for everyone in the clinical research ecosystem who's involved in long-term safety of gene therapies. And that includes academic and industry researchers, doctors, regulators, patient advocacy organizations, and research oversight professionals. We wanted to provide resources and recommendations that support best practices for the design of these studies. And we also aim to put forward ideas on innovative approaches for making long-term follow-up studies better. And then just to say, there are also specific parts of the toolkit that are specifically designed for patients and their care partners.
That's so interesting. You know, collaboration is central to everything we do at the MRCT Center. Can you share with us who was in the work group, who was around the table when this was being developed?
So once we decided that long-term follow-up was an important topic, a challenge that the MRCT Center could address using our model of multi-stakeholder collaborative approaches, we launched a working group for this topic, which got started in September 2024, rolled up our sleeves. We had about 25 external members, of which 22 chose to be acknowledged by name in the toolkit. And it was a diverse group by design, which is usually, as you know, what we do at the MRCT Center. We try and include different perspectives to make the work better. And for us, that included patients, patient advocacy representatives, and folks from industry, academic medical centers, clinical research organizations, and human research ethics and oversight organizations as well. And it was really important that we had complementary medical, regulatory, and ethics expertise. And it was also really important that patients were part of this as well, which they were. And we're really grateful for everyone's support to get this work done. And this toolkit was the result of a huge collaborative effort that included work from both internal MRCT Center team members and the work and support of the external members as well. And just to take a pause, like I want to, the focus of our conversation today is on the toolkit, but we also, along the course of our work together, were able to put out a number of different discussions on the topic, and we were through webinars and panels, and those are available on demand on the Cell and Gene Therapies project page on our website, mrctcenter.org.
That's so helpful. It sounds like a really involved and engaged group, and really a contribution from everyone to bring this together. But why is the resource timely now, and why release it now?
Yeah. And just to say, we released a draft in November of 2025. We put that out for public comment, and then getting feedback from people who were interested and reviewed the toolkit. We then made some revisions, and we released the new version, which we're calling version 2.0 in January 2026. So the reason it's timely is because, gene therapies are still a relatively new therapeutic class. So they're definitely past proof of principle, with dozens having received marketing authorization. And this category is expected to continue to grow, but based on the benefits that we've seen. But it's timely because we're at the point where we can learn from the past, and also we need to make long-term follow-up sustainable for the future as the category grows. Because gene therapy, pivotal trials have small numbers in terms of participants, and also because gene therapies as a class are still relatively new in terms of time frame, experts still believe we have a gap in knowledge about long-term safety for the class, and also specifically for any new investigational gene therapy. So they're still important to do long-term follow-up studies. And so while there's agreement that long-term follow-up studies are needed, collective experience now to date proves that they are very burdensome. And so this toolkit and the working group aim to sort of come together to clarify the challenges and to make recommendations on best practices for protocol design and execution.
So it does seem like we're learning something new about gene therapies almost every day. But it is, I have to say, a very, very long toolkit. What does it include, and how should we be thinking about using it?
So just to say, I agree it is pretty comprehensive. And also just to note, we don't expect people to read it cover to cover. So thanks to the help of our communications and design colleagues at the MRCT Center, the toolkit contains clickable interactive toolbars to make navigation between the sections and subsections really easy to jump around. So you can go to the resources that are most relevant and important or interesting to you. And then also one of the big feedback that we got with the draft toolkit was that it was so helpful, but also really long. And so we've added an executive summary, which is both available in the beginning of the compiled toolkit, but also is released as a standalone resource. And so this helps folks who are busy, and aren't we all, get a high-level overview of the toolkit's purpose, intended audience, and structure, as well as a summary of its most important points and recommendations. And that will enable you to figure out what you might find most useful and helpful. And so just really to give you a little bit more detail, there's actually 11 different sections of the toolkit. There's 3 that form the core: the guiding principles, considerations and recommendations, and the looking forward sections. And so the most detailed part of the toolkit is what we call the considerations and recommendations section. And that's really a robust guidance framework spanning 9 key domains, which align with the development of a study protocol in terms of planning and execution. And then, we have the additional resources, which include the guiding principles, which basically have our high-level ideas about making these protocols and the best practice for their ethical design as well. So those also span a variety of topics. And those were actually what we started with as a working group, which kind of guided the whole project. And then there's a lot of additional resources. For example, perhaps, again, in response to feedback, we learned that patients are really interested in long-term follow-up, but the toolkit was perhaps a little bit more than what they needed or wanted, and sort of also relatively technical. And so for the revision, we've created both and it's available in the toolkit and also as a standalone resource, a patient-facing information pamphlet that explains key considerations that they would want to know, including like what long-term follow-up is, the choices patients may have, and example questions they may want to ask. And so we also believe that the patient resource will be helpful to organizations that are developing their own patient-directed resources on long-term follow-up for specific gene therapies. And then the other resources provide clear background and contextual information about the purpose, scope, and types of long-term follow-up, including tables and charts that simplify and organize complex information. There's a compilation of international regulatory guidance on long-term follow-up with direct links so that you can see what the different countries say about it. There's also a big section on key design elements for long-term follow-up studies supporting FDA-approved gene therapies. And there are technical and plain language glossary resources. And then finally, and last but not least, we have a looking forward section, which poses critical questions to spur innovation and encourage bolder forward-thinking approaches to optimizing long-term follow-up in the future.
So one of the pieces that I really loved was the concept of Goldilocks. Now, I know that in a different context because I have children and I was a child once, but tell us what that means for a study designer.
So if you remember the Goldilocks fairy tale, it's about a child who comes upon a house of bears and she finds different things in the house, and some of them are too small or too big, and then there's some that are just right, or too hot for the porridge, or too cold, and then she finds some that are a bowl of porridge that's just right. And so it's kind of the just right approach, but to a very specific technical scientific context, which is long-term follow-up studies. So it's in this context, it's the challenge of finding the data collection level that's just right, not too much and not too little. And if we make the scope of a long-term follow-up study too large, what happens is that we increase the burden on patients and sites. And that can lead to, a lot of things, but in particular, it can lead to participant burden, and that means that people might not complete the study. They might not complete the follow-up, the planned follow-up, and their results can't be included in the analysis. But if we collect too little data in the plan and we go out with something that's too narrow, we also risk missing important information, particularly safety signals. So the toolkit recommends careful consideration of these issues, but also overall, the overarching recommendation is really to collect the minimum data set sufficient to address the study goals, given that these are very long-term studies because of considering the burdens that they can bring to sponsors, and we need them to be completed. And of course, we also note in the toolkit that it's important to involve patients in the study design process to make sure that their viewpoints are considered in terms of figuring out which endpoints are most important to collect and study.
So it's really interesting. It's really a balance between having the right information, which you can only collect at the time, and people having to comply for what could be 5, 15 years in order to learn what we need to know about the intervention, which happened oh so long ago that other things intervene. And this is very burdensome to participants. Or patients. So what other recommendations does the toolkit have for minimizing the burden on either patients or participants? I guess patients are when it's approved and participants when it's still in trial.
Yes. And just to say, you're right that long-term follow-up studies can follow recipients of investigational gene therapies, which usually would be people who participated in clinical trials or maybe less commonly received investigational gene therapies through expanded access. They can also follow recipients of approved gene therapies in what's called post-marketing long-term follow-up studies. But just to go back to the patient participant burden, and of course, really, they're probably all patients because we're not talking about usually healthy, healthy individuals in the case of gene therapies just yet. Come in, 100 years or maybe 50 years, 10 years even. I don't know, but we're not there yet though. So how to minimize participant burden is one of the big themes. And central to this right-sized data collection strategy we just discussed, the toolkit also highlights other operational approaches, including leveraging decentralized approaches, which just means really bringing the research to the participants as much as possible. So, for example, making it possible to do in-person visits with their local healthcare providers rather than coming into an academic medical center, which may be far away from their home, or if possible, using telehealth visits or online check-ins with mobile health technology. And then if in-person visits are necessary, sponsors and study designers should consider whether the number, duration, and spacing of the visits can be minimized or at least optimized, for example, combined with other visits that they might also need to have in terms of clinical care to ease the burden. The toolkit also recommends that researchers should carefully consider that burdens to individual participants will vary. So in other words, as a group, there might be a certain burden level, but there might be some participants in the study that have quite more significant burden. They might be farther. They might have socioeconomic challenges. In the toolkit, we note that sponsors should really think carefully about these burdens that patients and participants would experience and potentially include offering financial support to cover travel and other expenses.
Yeah. It does seem that making sure that you have good follow-up early after the gene therapy is really incredibly important. But then life intervenes, and later on, you're looking for bigger things. You're not looking for, so the timing becomes less critical, I would think. I don't know if you agree with that.
I think overall, the long-term follow-up studies do get less intensive as they further out from.
Well, that's good. That's good. So, if somebody finds this just too burdensome and wants to leave the study, do they just stop entirely, or are there other alternatives to total withdrawal that the toolkit or you would recommend?
So, the working group really thought carefully about this, and one of the recommendations was that, of course, this is true for any study teams should inform participants about their rights to withdraw from a long-term follow-up study. However, there is a difference in that gene therapies may be permanent or durable in your body. So there also needs to be education that, withdrawing from long-term follow-up does not mean withdrawing from the therapy in some cases. And so there might be for participants and gene therapy recipients to really carefully consider the benefits and burdens of participating as they make that choice. The toolkit also recommends a pre-plan for planners, study designers, to think about withdrawal as a possibility. It might become more inconvenient for people to participate over time, or they might move, or so withdrawal or loss to follow-up is a significant potential. So what study planners can do is potentially think about that ahead of time and have the protocol offer a step-down approach where a minimal level of data collection can be taken, for example, without participant involvement, such as from their electronic health records. And of course, this would, you would need to get participant consent for this, but with advanced planning, that could be possible.
That's a great idea. So obviously you're collecting a lot of information from all of the patients and participants or patients. How do you communicate the results of the long-term follow-up, and who are you communicating them to?
So the return of results is another big issue addressed by the toolkit. So the working group came up with a number of different recommendations. So first, the toolkit recommends that long-term follow-up participants should be provided with any actionable individual results that are obtained, including interim results, meaning results that the researchers know about even before the study has been fully completed. And when we say actionable, we mean results that might influence or change a patient's medical or personal decision-making in clinical care or healthcare or otherwise. So, for example, the results may make patients eligible for more frequent screenings for cancer or other health issues. Second, if there are significant safety concerns that are detected in the course of the study, these need to be communicated not only to participants, but also to potentially the patient, scientific, medical, and regulatory communities at large. So obviously doctors may want to know to be able to share that with other patients who may not be part of the study. And so the responsible design and analysis of a long-term follow-up studies should map out a plan from prompt information sharing with regulators, which is absolutely required, site staff, long-term follow-up study participants, and ethics committees, and again, communities at large. And, one of the things that we discussed is that informed consent for the product, for example, if it's approved, even if it's approved, might need to be updated. If studies are ongoing, all the informed consents for ongoing studies or trials and long-term follow-up studies might need to be updated as well. And patients may need to be notified even sooner than that if necessary. The third thing is that the toolkit states that sponsors should make every effort to publicly and transparently share final and interim, as appropriate, aggregate results of the studies. And aggregate meaning here the overall findings from all the data rather than the results from any one participant. And just to say, the toolkit even goes so far as to say that long-term follow-up studies should exceed regulatory and policy requirements for registration and results reporting. And, even though some of the long-term follow-up studies may be classified as observational, all long-term follow-up studies should be registered and results should be submitted in accordance with the expectations for interventional studies.
Very, very helpful. You talk a lot about when this study is over. A long-term follow-up study, it might take 2 or 3 years to do the study at all, and then you're following patients for potentially 15 years. We're looking at 20 years, maybe, sometimes longer. What happens if a company goes out of business or a program is discontinued before the monitoring is completed?
Yeah, and you make a really good point. Usually, the longest long-term follow-up studies, and there's a little bit of confusion around this because there can be monitoring for a lifetime that's recommended for certain types of gene therapies, but there's some, lack of clarity about who's responsible for that lifetime monitoring, whether it's the doctors or the clinical care or whether it's the companies that are sponsoring the trials. But in any event, it's definitely clear that they can last up to 15 years and that can definitely be longer than 15 years if you consider that a study might take place over a period of time and people might join at different times, right? So it could go on for longer than 15 years. And that's a really long time. So the possibility that a company goes out of business or a program is discontinued is a real possibility. And it's a tough reality that we tried to address in the toolkit, but it perhaps not completely solve. But what we do recommend is that sponsors should have a default plan for completing their long-term follow-up obligations, and it is an obligation to the patients and participants in the communities. In the unfortunate case of program termination, this plan should be communicated to participants during the initial informed consent. And if they do end up ceasing operations or discontinuing the specific program, they absolutely should consult with regulators about that plan. And the goal really is to ensure that patients are appropriately monitored and that long-term follow-up data is collected, if at all possible, since it is so important and valuable. And then again, just to go back to what I was saying before, another important question is when that responsibility for monitoring, long-term follow-up monitoring should transition to clinical care, which can be somewhat ill-defined. And so we make a big point to also say that careful and ongoing monitoring should be standardly included in clinical care after a patient receives either an investigational or an approved gene therapy.
Thank you. So I just want to, before we wrap up, emphasize again, this toolkit, what are the resources that are available for participants? If you could just restate that.
Yeah, of course. So again, like with feedback from the community on the draft toolkit, we created a standalone resource for patients. And that basically explains in, plain language terms what they might want to know about long-term follow-up and what it is, what their choices are, the rights they have, and it gives examples, questions that they might want to ask if they have the opportunity or are considering a gene therapy clinical trial, for example.
That's
or
great.
gene therapy
That's
product
great.
in the course of clinical
So they
care.
don't have to be technically sophisticated to read that.
No,
It's really available and written for them. So how should the toolkit be implemented for real impact? We know now that participants and patients have a resource that will really help them get educated about the long-term follow-up. What about the rest of the toolkit? How should that be implemented?
So, really, we think that this toolkit provides free resources and expert multi-stakeholder expert guidance to support smarter long-term follow-up studies. And so, one of the things that we note is that when you are researching gene therapies or developing gene therapies, you really need to think about long-term follow-up at the earliest stages of planning, and it needs to be part of the clinical development strategy for gene therapies from the beginning and not an afterthought. And so this toolkit, basically provides information, education to help you get up to speed on what this is all about and ideas about best practices. So it's meant as a resource for the whole community in that way. And then just to say, for real impact, I think we all, the working group members all agree that we should be looking ahead as well to how we can improve long-term follow-up in the future and sort of bigger picture questions that the field should consider. So, for example, one thing that we suggest is that the field should try to move towards standardization and harmonization of data collection for long-term follow-up to enable comparison of results across different gene therapy products and disease populations. We also encourage sponsors to consider innovative designs like master or umbrella protocols to increase efficiency as appropriate.
Well, thank you, Carolyn, and thank you for your leadership of this project, and most particularly for the working group members and all the people who've worked on it and sort of contributed to the final product, which is really a remarkable piece of work, and I hope will be implemented and is useful to the population at large, since every audience has something that they can benefit from in this toolkit. We've already heard feedback about how helpful the toolkit is to people that are developing their own organizational policies and protocols for long-term follow-up with gene therapies. And we anticipate additional work on the long-term follow-up issues will build on and from this resource. Listeners can find the full toolkit as well as standalone versions of the executive summary and patient resource at mrctcenter.org/LTFU toolkit. If you have questions or suggestions, we want to hear from you. Please do reach out to us at mrct@bwh.harvard.edu. Thank you.
Thanks so much.
Since 2009, the MRCT Center has been an independent, pre-competitive convener engaging diverse stakeholders from industry, academia, patients and patient advocacy groups, nonprofit organizations, and regulatory agencies to deliver ethical, actionable, and practical solutions for the global clinical trial enterprise. Our resources are freely available at mrctcenter.org. Follow us on LinkedIn and sign up to receive our monthly newsletter on our website. Finally, please like and subscribe to this podcast channel. We really look forward to many exciting discussions to come, and thank you for listening.